The Philadelphia physician removed his gloves and stepped back from the examination table in March of 1892. The woman lying before him had skin that wept and blistered wherever her husband's hands had touched her. The tissue was separating from the muscle beneath. He had never seen anything like it in 20 years of practice. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now let's continue with the story. Medical literature from the late 19th century contains many curiosities, conditions that defied understanding and challenged the limited diagnostic tools available to physicians of that era. But among these documented mysteries, few cases proved as disturbing as the woman whose body rejected physical contact with the man she had married. The phenomenon appeared in multiple medical journals between 1892 and 1893, described with the clinical detachment that characterized Victorian medical writing. Yet beneath the sterile language of scientific observation lay a horror that transcended mere physical pathology. The case first came to medical attention through Dr. Cornelius Ashford, a respected Philadelphia physician whose practice served the city's middle-class families. Ashford maintained meticulous records, a habit that would prove crucial to understanding the progression of this unprecedented condition. His initial examination notes, preserved in the archives of the Pennsylvania Medical Society, describe a young woman in her early 20s presenting with extensive dermatological damage concentrated on her arms, neck, and torso. The lesions varied in severity, from areas of simple erythema to regions where the epidermis had completely separated, leaving raw, suppurating wounds that showed signs of secondary infection. What distinguished this case from typical dermatitis was the pattern of injury. The damage appeared exclusively in areas subject to physical contact during marital relations. Ashford noted this distribution with scientific precision while avoiding explicit description of the circumstances that created it. Victorian medical journals permitted discussion of sensitive matters only through euphemism and indirect reference, a constraint that sometimes obscured critical details. But Ashford's meaning was clear to his professional colleagues. This woman's body was destroying itself in response to intimate contact with her husband. The condition had appeared shortly after the couple's wedding in September of 1891. What began as minor irritation following the wedding night had progressed within months to tissue necrosis extensive enough to threaten her life. The woman reported that symptoms appeared within hours of physical contact and intensified with repeated exposure. Areas that had begun to heal would rupture anew following subsequent marital encounters, creating a cycle of damage and incomplete recovery that prevented any genuine healing. Ashford consulted colleagues, searching for similar cases in medical literature. He found scattered references to contact dermatitis and cases of what physicians termed hysterical skin manifestations, but nothing matching the severity or specific pattern he observed. Some doctors proposed it was psychosomatic, the physical expression of sexual repulsion or nervous disorder. Others suggested genuine physiological incompatibility, perhaps related to differences in skin chemistry or secretions. A few speculated about infection, though the woman showed no symptoms of venereal disease and her husband appeared entirely healthy. The young woman herself, identified in medical records only by initials to preserve propriety, provided testimony that complicated easy diagnosis. She insisted the reaction was involuntary, that she wished to fulfill her wifely duties, but her body responded with violent rejection. She described the sensation as burning that began within minutes of contact, followed by swelling, fluid accumulation, and finally, the breakdown of tissue that left open wounds, requiring weeks to partially heal. The pain was severe enough to prevent sleep and made normal movement difficult when lesions covered large areas. Yet despite documentation of this progressive tissue destruction, despite multiple physicians confirming that continued exposure would prove fatal, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Victorian marriage law granted husbands conjugal rights that wives could not legally refuse. Religious doctrine reinforced this legal framework, teaching that wives must submit to husbands in all matters. Social pressure from family and community supported male authority over female autonomy. The woman was trapped in a situation where her body was being destroyed by contact she could not prevent, bound by laws and customs that valued marital hierarchy over individual survival. The marriage arrangement had been negotiated in the spring of 1891, following protocols that governed respectable courtship among Philadelphia's middle class. Her father operated a modestly successful printing business, providing his family with comfortable circumstances without extravagance. The potential groom, a merchant named Theodore Grayson, had established himself in the dry goods trade, managing a profitable shop on Market Street that catered to the city's growing population. At 32 years of age, he was considered an excellent prospect for a woman of 20 who needed to secure her future before youth faded. The young woman, whose given name was Beatrice, had received education appropriate to her station. She could read, write, manage household accounts, and perform the domestic skills expected of a merchant's wife. Her family considered her fortunate to attract the attention of someone as established as Grayson, who could have chosen from numerous candidates. The fact that he selected Beatrice suggested either genuine affection or recognition of qualities that made her particularly suitable for his needs. Their courtship followed rigid conventions. Grayson visited the family home on Sunday afternoons, sitting in the parlor while Beatrice's mother remained present as chaperone. Conversations covered acceptable topics: literature, current events discussed without controversial opinion, plans for the future stated in generalities that committed neither party to specifics. Grayson appeared attentive and proper, his manners polished, his prospects solid. Beatrice found him neither particularly appealing nor objectionable. She understood that romantic love was a luxury, not a requirement for marriage. Affection might develop over time, but security and respectability mattered more. The engagement was announced in August, with the wedding scheduled for September to allow adequate preparation. Beatrice's mother supervised the assembly of her trousseau, ensuring she would enter marriage with appropriate clothing, linens, and household items. The family spent money they could barely afford on these necessities, viewing it as investment in their daughter's future. Beatrice herself felt the weight of their financial sacrifice, understanding that this marriage represented her family's hopes as much as her own fate. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon at Fourth Presbyterian Church, a respectable but not ostentatious venue that matched the couple's social standing. Approximately 60 guests attended, representing both families and their business connections. The ceremony proceeded without incident. Beatrice wore white silk borrowed from a cousin, adorned with lace her mother had saved for years. Grayson appeared in a new suit, purchased specifically for the occasion. The minister delivered a sermon emphasizing wifely submission and husbandly authority, standard doctrine that nobody in attendance questioned. The wedding breakfast followed at the bride's family home, a modest gathering with food prepared over several days by Beatrice's mother and aunts. Guests offered congratulations and advice, much of it directed at the bride regarding her duties and obligations. Several older women took her aside to provide whispered instruction about the wedding night, speaking in euphemisms that conveyed urgency without clarity. Beatrice listened with growing anxiety, understanding that something significant would occur that evening, but receiving no specific information that might prepare her for it. By late afternoon, the couple departed for a hotel where they would spend their first night before traveling to Atlantic City for a brief wedding trip. Grayson had reserved a room at the Continental Hotel, an establishment known for discretion regarding newlywed guests. Beatrice's family waved goodbye with expressions of satisfaction, confident they had secured their daughter's future. Beatrice herself felt numb, exhausted from the day's activities, and anxious about the night ahead. Nothing in her upbringing or the afternoon's celebrations suggested anything unusual about this marriage. Grayson had shown no signs of cruelty or peculiarity during courtship. His references checked favorably. His business reputation was solid, his religious observance regular. By every measure available to her family, he represented a safe choice, a respectable man who would provide adequately for a wife and future children. The marriage appeared entirely ordinary, one of hundreds contracted that month across Philadelphia. Yet within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, Beatrice's body would begin responding to her husband's touch with a violence that suggested something fundamentally wrong lurked beneath the surface of this respectable union. The first symptoms would appear before dawn, initiating a cascade of physical destruction that would ultimately prove fatal. But as she rode in the carriage toward the hotel, wearing her borrowed white dress and carrying the hopes of her family, Beatrice had no warning of the horror that awaited her once the door closed and propriety's public mask could be discarded in favor of private reality. Beatrice woke before dawn, with her arms burning. The sensation pulled her from shallow sleep into confused awareness, her mind struggling to orient itself in the unfamiliar hotel room. Pale light filtered through heavy curtains, revealing her husband asleep beside her, his breathing steady and undisturbed. She lifted her arms in the dim light and saw angry red welts covering her skin from wrist to shoulder, raised and hot to the touch. The wedding night had been everything the whispered warnings suggested, and worse. Grayson had shown neither gentleness nor patience, treating the consummation as a right to be claimed rather than an experience to be shared. Beatrice had endured it with gritted teeth, telling herself this was normal. This was what marriage meant. This was the price women paid for security. But now, examining her inflamed skin in the growing daylight, she wondered if something had gone wrong beyond the expected discomfort. She rose carefully to avoid waking her husband and examined herself more thoroughly. The welts appeared wherever he had gripped her most firmly during the night. Her neck showed similar marks, and when she removed her nightgown to check further, she discovered that the rash extended across her torso in patterns that mapped exactly where his body had pressed against hers. The affected areas felt hot and slightly swollen, the skin tender enough that even the light fabric of her nightgown caused discomfort. Beatrice had no framework for understanding what she was seeing. Perhaps it was nerves manifesting physically, as her mother had suggested might happen. Or maybe she had developed a sudden sensitivity to the soap used on the hotel linens. She had always been prone to minor skin irritations, developing hives from certain foods or fabrics. This seemed more severe than her usual reactions, but surely it would fade within a day or two. She dressed carefully, choosing a high-necked gown that would conceal the marks on her neck and arms, and said nothing when Grayson woke. They traveled to Atlantic City as planned, spending 5 days at a boarding house near the beach. Grayson seemed pleased with the arrangements, spending his days walking the boardwalk, while Beatrice remained in their room, claiming fatigue from the wedding excitement. In truth, the rash had not faded. It had spread. New welts appeared each night following marital relations, and the original sites had begun to blister, forming fluid-filled pockets that burst when touched, leaving raw patches that stung viciously. By the 3rd day, Beatrice could no longer hide her condition. Grayson noticed her flinching when he touched her arm and demanded to know what was wrong. She showed him the blisters, explaining that she must have developed some sensitivity, perhaps to soap or the salt air. He examined the damage with a frown that suggested annoyance rather than concern. She needed to see a doctor when they returned to Philadelphia, he said. This was unseemly, and if she was ill, it needed to be addressed promptly. He made no offer to modify his nightly demands, despite the obvious pain they caused her. The return to Philadelphia brought no relief. They moved into rooms Grayson had rented in a respectable boarding house, where they would live until he could afford to purchase a proper home. Beatrice spent her first day as a settled wife, unpacking their possessions, with hands that had begun to show signs of infection where the blisters had burst. The raw areas wept clear fluid that stained her sleeves and attracted flies when she worked in the kitchen, helping the landlady prepare meals. The family physician, summoned discreetly after a week when the condition showed no improvement, examined her with pursed lips and disapproving expression. Dr. Holbrook had treated Beatrice since childhood and knew her tendency toward minor ailments. He attributed this outbreak to nervous hysteria, a diagnosis commonly applied to women's complaints that men found inconvenient or embarrassing. Hysterical women, he explained to Grayson rather than to Beatrice herself, often manifested psychological distress through physical symptoms. The cure was rest, prayer, and acceptance of wifely duties without resistance or complaint. Dwelling on the symptoms would only make them worse. Beatrice tried to follow his advice. She rested when household work permitted. She prayed for healing and for strength to endure. She accepted her husband's attentions without protest, though each encounter left new wounds that required days to scab over. But acceptance did not cure her. The condition spread despite her compliance, moving from her arms and neck to her face, leaving angry welts across her cheeks that she could not conceal. Within a month of marriage, Beatrice looked like a woman recovering from severe burns, her skin mottled with scabs and fresh blisters that marked her as damaged in ways that invited speculation and judgment from everyone who saw her. By December of 1891, Beatrice had consulted 3 different physicians, each offering contradictory diagnoses that led nowhere. Dr. Holbrook's prescription of rest and submission had obviously failed. The second physician, a specialist in skin diseases recommended by Grayson's business associate, examined the lesions and declared them fungal in origin. He prescribed mercury compounds applied directly to the affected areas twice daily. The treatment burned like liquid fire, causing Beatrice to bite through her lip to avoid screaming during application. After 2 weeks, her skin showed signs of mercury poisoning, but no improvement in the underlying condition. The third doctor, an older man with a practice near the waterfront, took a different approach. Dr. Cornelius Ashford examined Beatrice with methodical thoroughness, asking questions the other physicians had not considered important. When did the symptoms first appear? Did they worsen or improve during specific times? Had she noticed any pattern to the outbreaks? Beatrice answered honestly. though propriety made it difficult to explain that the worst damage always followed nights when her husband exercised his marital rights most vigorously. Ashford listened without interruption, his expression grave. When the examination concluded, he spent several minutes reviewing his notes before speaking. What he was about to say would sound peculiar, he warned, but medical literature contained rare cases of individuals developing severe reactions to physical contact with specific people. The condition was poorly understood, possibly related to incompatibilities in skin chemistry or perhaps immune responses to foreign proteins. In Beatrice's case, the pattern suggested she was experiencing an extreme form of contact dermatitis specific to her husband. The diagnosis hung in the air like an accusation. Grayson, who had insisted on attending this consultation, immediately objected. This was impossible, he said. Wives did not develop allergies to their husbands. If such a condition existed, it would be common knowledge, discussed openly. The very suggestion was insulting, implying something unnatural about his person or their union. Ashford remained calm, explaining that medical science encountered rare conditions regularly, phenomena that defied common understanding but occurred nonetheless. The evidence of Beatrice's skin told a clear story, regardless of how unusual that story might be. Grayson demanded solutions rather than explanations. If his wife had somehow developed this aberrant sensitivity, what treatment would cure it? Ashford hesitated before responding. In cases of contact dermatitis, the standard recommendation was avoiding the substance causing the reaction. But in this situation, avoiding contact meant abstaining from marital relations, which created obvious problems given Victorian marriage laws and social expectations. He could prescribe soothing ointments for the lesions and medications to reduce inflammation, but these addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental issue was the contact itself. This answer satisfied no one. Grayson rejected any suggestion that he modify his behavior or expectations. He had married to have a wife in all senses that term implied, and no mysterious skin condition would deprive him of rights guaranteed by law and scripture. Beatrice, caught between her husband's anger and the doctor's clinical assessment, said nothing. She had no power to negotiate or refuse. Her body was destroying itself in response to her husband's touch, but her husband's right to touch her superseded her body's desperate attempts at self-preservation. Ashford prescribed what little he could offer: zinc oxide ointments, bandages to protect the worst lesions, and laudanum for pain. He also provided something more dangerous, a quiet suggestion that Beatrice might benefit from extended rest away from marital duties, perhaps a stay with her family while the lesions healed. Grayson seized on this final point with cold fury. His wife would not be returning to her parents like a child, unable to fulfill adult responsibilities. She would remain in their rooms, perform her duties, and overcome this hysteria through discipline and prayer. The consultation ended with Beatrice no better off than before. She had a diagnosis that explained her suffering, but no treatment that addressed its cause. Ashford's notes, filed carefully in his records, documented the conversation with clinical precision. He noted the husband's refusal to modify behavior despite medical evidence of harm. He recorded his opinion that continued contact would likely prove fatal if the condition progressed. But his notes also revealed the limits of medical authority when confronted with legal and social structures that granted husbands absolute power over wives' bodies. He could document the horror. He could not prevent it. Beatrice left the office with prescriptions she knew would prove useless. The ointments might soothe existing wounds, but would not prevent new ones. The laudanum would dull pain, but not eliminate its source. She was trapped in a body that rejected her husband, and a marriage that rejected her body's autonomy. Medical science had identified her problem with unprecedented precision. It simply had no solution that Victorian society would permit. Beatrice's sister discovered the extent of the damage during a visit in January of 1892. Catherine had come unannounced, concerned by reports from mutual acquaintances that Beatrice looked unwell at church services. What she found in the cramped boarding house rooms horrified her. Beatrice's arms were wrapped in stained bandages. Her face bore scabs in various stages of healing. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone in constant pain, flinching when Catherine embraced her. The sisters sat together while Beatrice explained what the past 4 months had brought. She spoke in whispers, glancing toward the door to ensure Grayson had truly left for his shop. Catherine listened with mounting alarm as Beatrice described the progression of symptoms, the useless medical consultations, and, most disturbing, her husband's absolute refusal to acknowledge that his actions were killing her. He viewed her condition as either willful malingering or divine punishment for insufficient devotion. Each night, he insisted on his marital rights, regardless of how her flesh responded. Catherine urged immediate action. Beatrice must leave, must return to their parents' home until her health recovered. But Beatrice explained with defeated patience that leaving was impossible. Marriage law gave Grayson complete authority over her person and property. If she left without his permission, he could compel her return through legal means. Her father lacked the financial resources to challenge a husband's rights in court, and even if he possessed such resources, no judge would rule against a husband whose only crime was exercising legal privileges. Victorian law treated wives as property, not persons with autonomous rights to self-preservation. Catherine's next suggestion was appealing to religious authority. Surely their minister would intervene if he understood the severity of Beatrice's condition. But Beatrice had already pursued this avenue. Grayson had taken her to Reverend Cuthbert the previous week, seeking spiritual counsel about her persistent ailments. The minister had listened to Grayson's complaints about his wife's physical deterioration, interfering with proper marital relations, then delivered a sermon on wifely submission drawn from Ephesians. Wives must submit to husbands as unto the Lord, he reminded them. Physical suffering was often God's method of teaching obedience and breaking sinful pride. Reverend Cuthbert had prayed over Beatrice, asking God to heal her body, and more importantly, her spirit of resistance. He suggested that her condition might improve if she approached her duties with more willing acceptance, rather than the obvious reluctance her husband reported. Women who fought against their divine role often experienced mysterious illnesses that vanished once they embraced proper submission. The Reverend's wife, present during this consultation, had nodded approvingly, offering her own testimony about how many female complaints disappeared when women accepted their place in God's hierarchy. Catherine absorbed this information with barely controlled rage, but rage accomplished nothing. The structures that imprisoned Beatrice were not individual cruelties, but systemic architecture. Law, religion, medicine, and social custom all reinforced male authority over female autonomy. Even well-meaning interventions foundered against this bedrock assumption that husbands owned wives in ways that superseded concerns about physical harm or survival. Grayson's male relatives supported his position when Catherine attempted to appeal to family loyalty. His older brother, a clerk in a law office, explained with patient condescension that wives had no legal standing to refuse marital duties under any circumstances. The marriage contract granted husbands perpetual consent that wives could not withdraw. If Beatrice found these duties unpleasant, that was unfortunate, but irrelevant. Many wives disliked aspects of marriage, yet performed their obligations without developing dramatic physical symptoms. His father was more blunt. Grayson had paid good money for the wedding and taken on responsibility for supporting a wife. He deserved to receive what he had purchased. If Beatrice could not fulfill basic wifely functions, perhaps she should be committed to an asylum where hysterical women received treatment through isolation and discipline. This suggestion was not made in jest. Commitment to mental institutions required only a husband's signature, no medical evaluation or judicial review necessary. Many inconvenient wives had vanished into such facilities, emerging months or years later, broken into more manageable compliance. The threat hung over Beatrice like an executioner's blade. She could endure her husband's nightly assaults and the progressive destruction of her flesh, or she could resist and face institutionalization that would likely prove worse. Asylums in 1892 used treatments ranging from enforced bed rest to cold water immersion to more experimental interventions that left patients permanently damaged. Women committed for hysteria often remained confined for years, deemed cured only when they had learned to suppress all complaints and accept any treatment men chose to impose. Catherine left that January afternoon, understanding that her sister was trapped beyond rescue. The law provided no escape. Religion sanctified the torture. Medicine documented the harm, but could not prevent it. Society viewed Beatrice's suffering as the natural consequence of female existence. Unfortunate, perhaps, but not unjust. She was dying by degrees, her skin literally rotting away from repeated contact she had no legal right to refuse, and every institution in Victorian America conspired to ensure that torture continued, uninterrupted until death provided mercy. The law would not. By March of 1892, Beatrice could no longer perform basic household tasks. Her hands had deteriorated to the point where gripping utensils caused fresh blisters to form and burst. The landlady, initially sympathetic, had grown cold as Beatrice failed to contribute her share of domestic labor. Other boarders complained about the smell emanating from the Grayson rooms, a sickly sweet odor of infection that no amount of carbolic soap could mask. Several residents had requested that the couple be asked to leave, but Grayson paid his rent promptly and threatened legal action if evicted without cause. Dr. Ashford's examinations had become weekly events, his concern mounting with each visit. His notes from this period, preserved in medical archives, chronicle a descent into systemic collapse. The skin damage had progressed beyond simple contact dermatitis into something far more severe. Tissue necrosis had begun in areas subject to repeated trauma, with dead flesh literally separating from living muscle beneath. Secondary infections ravaged the wounds despite applications of antiseptic solutions. Beatrice developed fevers that spiked each evening, her body struggling to fight bacterial invasions through compromised skin that provided no effective barrier. Weight loss became dramatic. Eating required effort Beatrice could barely muster. The lesions had spread to her mouth and throat, making swallowing painful. Food held no appeal when every bite caused agony. By April, she had lost nearly 30 pounds from an already slight frame, her clothes hanging loose on a body that seemed to be consuming itself from the inside out. Her face had taken on the gaunt, hollow appearance associated with terminal illness, eyes sunken in dark sockets, cheekbones prominent beneath damaged skin. Ashford documented each symptom with meticulous care, while privately despairing of his ability to alter the outcome. He wrote detailed letters to colleagues in other cities, describing the case and seeking advice. Most responses suggested the condition was psychosomatic and would resolve once the patient accepted her situation. A few physicians proposed more aggressive treatments involving cauterization of the wounds or experimental applications of electrical current to stimulate healing. One doctor from Boston suggested amputation of the most damaged limbs to prevent systemic infection, a recommendation so extreme even Ashford rejected it. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Beatrice's body was being destroyed by repeated contact with her husband, yet no authority would intervene to stop that contact. Ashford's medical opinion, stated clearly in letters to Grayson and Reverend Cuthbert, was that continued marital relations would prove fatal within months. The tissue damage was too extensive to heal while being constantly reopened. Blood poisoning had already begun, evidenced by the red streaks radiating from infected wounds up her arms and across her torso. Without complete cessation of the trauma causing these injuries, death was inevitable. Grayson's response to these warnings revealed the depths of his conviction that wives existed to serve husbands regardless of cost. He accused Ashford of encouraging female rebellion by suggesting that wives could refuse marital duties due to physical complaints. Every woman would claim mysterious ailments if they thought such claims could exempt them from obligations. His wife needed to overcome her weakness through prayer and discipline, not indulgence of hysterical symptoms. If she died, it would be God's will, not his responsibility. This theological fatalism found support from multiple sources. Grayson's business associates, men who viewed wives as investments requiring protection but not autonomy, agreed that indulging female complaints set dangerous precedents. The church community, while expressing sympathy for Beatrice's suffering, nonetheless maintained that earthly pain was temporary, while the soul's salvation required obedience to divine hierarchy. Better to die in submission than live in rebellion against God's ordained order. Beatrice herself seemed to have moved beyond resistance into numb acceptance. She no longer pleaded with her husband to show mercy. She stopped asking doctors for cures she knew they could not provide. When Catherine visited in May, she found her sister propped in bed, too weak to rise without assistance, her arms wrapped in bandages that required changing twice daily as they became soaked with discharge from weeping wounds. Beatrice spoke little, her voice reduced to whispers by lesions in her throat. She had the appearance of someone waiting for death with neither hope of recovery nor fear of the end. The only mercy was that pain had become so constant it had ceased to register as distinct sensation. Beatrice existed in a fog of laudanum and suffering, her body reduced to raw nerve endings that fired continuously until the signals lost meaning. She could no longer tell where one wound ended and another began. Her skin had become a map of damage so extensive that healthy tissue was the exception rather than the rule. Dr. Ashford's examination notes from late May describe a patient in the final stages of systemic failure, kept alive only by youth and stubborn biology that had not yet acknowledged defeat. The medical community's fascination with Beatrice's case grew as her condition defied every attempted explanation. Dr. Ashford presented the case to the Philadelphia Medical Society in June of 1892, displaying detailed sketches of the lesion patterns and tissue damage. The gathered physicians responded with intense interest and wildly divergent theories. This was precisely the kind of medical mystery that Victorian doctors found intellectually compelling, even as the human suffering behind the clinical details received less attention than the puzzle itself. The dominant theory, championed by several senior physicians, held that the condition was entirely psychosomatic. Beatrice's mind, repulsed by marital intimacy for reasons rooted in nervous temperament or inadequate preparation, was manifesting this revulsion through physical symptoms. The skin lesions were real enough, but their origin was mental rather than physiological. This explanation had the advantage of fitting established beliefs about female hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis applied to any woman's complaint that inconvenienced men or challenged medical understanding. A smaller faction proposed genuine biological incompatibility. Perhaps Grayson's sweat contained proteins or chemical compounds to which Beatrice's immune system mounted an allergic response. Medical literature contained scattered references to people developing sensitivities to specific substances, though nothing approaching the severity of Beatrice's reactions. One physician suggested that differences in skin bacteria might create toxic interactions when the couple's bodies came into contact. Another proposed that Grayson might carry some infectious agent, perhaps a mild fungus or parasite, that provoked extreme reactions in his wife while causing him no symptoms. Dr. Ashford himself leaned toward a third explanation, one he was careful to express only in private correspondence with trusted colleagues. He suspected the condition was neither purely mental nor purely biological, but rather a catastrophic interaction between chronic stress and physical trauma. Beatrice's body had entered a state of perpetual emergency response, her immune system attacking her own tissues in confused reaction to repeated violation. The stress of knowing each night would bring renewed pain created a feedback loop where psychological distress amplified physical damage, which in turn increased psychological trauma. This theory came closest to modern understanding of how severe stress can trigger autoimmune responses and systemic inflammation. But Ashford could not publish such observations without implicitly accusing Grayson of causing his wife's condition through brutal treatment. Victorian medical journals did not print articles suggesting that husbands might be harming wives through normal exercise of marital rights. The social cost of such publication would destroy Ashford's reputation and accomplish nothing for Beatrice. A few physicians, writing in journals that circulated among progressive medical circles, came even closer to naming the underlying horror. They noted that similar cases of mysterious female ailments often occurred in marriages where husbands exercised their conjugal rights with unusual frequency or violence. Women whose bodies literally fell apart under their husbands' hands were perhaps experiencing physical manifestations of trauma that society refused to acknowledge. These observations remained carefully coded, using language that preserved plausible deniability while hinting at truths more explicit. Statement would render unprintable. The debate reached beyond medical journals into popular press, though in sanitized form, that protected readers from disturbing details. Newspapers reported on the mysterious case of a Philadelphia woman suffering from an unknown condition that baffled doctors. Some articles speculated about divine judgment or moral failing. Others took a more sympathetic tone, portraying Beatrice as a tragic victim of medical ignorance. None mentioned that her husband continued imposing the very contact that doctors had identified as lethal, because printing such facts would require acknowledging that husbands could legally kill wives through abuse masked as marital privilege. Modern medical analysis of the preserved case records suggests Beatrice was suffering from a combination of severe contact dermatitis, chronic stress-induced immune dysfunction, and repeated physical trauma. Her body was essentially attacking itself in response to a threat it could neither escape nor effectively fight. The psychosomatic element was real, but not in the way Victorian doctors understood it. Her mind was not imagining symptoms, Rather, her psychological state was influencing her immune system's behavior, creating a situation where stress hormones and inflammatory responses combined to destroy healthy tissue. But whether the condition was purely physical, purely psychological, or some combination of both ultimately mattered less than the social context that sustained it. Beatrice could have been suffering from any ailment, common or rare, curable or terminal. The defining feature of her case was not the medical mystery, but the legal and social structures that prevented intervention. She was dying because her body could not tolerate her husband's touch, and she was forced to endure that touch because Victorian law granted husbands ownership of wives' bodies that superseded women's right to physical integrity or survival. The medical debate was theater, intellectual exercise that obscured the simple truth that Beatrice was being tortured to death with society's full approval and the law's explicit protection. July brought heat that transformed Beatrice's room into a furnace. The boarding house lacked adequate ventilation, and the stench of infected tissue grew overwhelming in the stagnant air. Flies gathered despite screens, drawn by the smell of decay. Beatrice lay motionless under thin sheets, too weak to brush away insects that crawled across her bandaged arms. Her breathing had become labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort, as though her body was forgetting how to perform basic functions. Dr. Ashford's visits had increased to daily occurrences, not because he had new treatments to offer, but because he felt compelled to document the final stages of this unprecedented decline. His notes from early July describe a patient barely conscious, responsive only to direct questions, and then only with single-word answers. The infection had spread beyond localized wounds into her bloodstream. Her fever remained constant at dangerous levels. Red streaks radiated from every major wound site, visible evidence of blood poisoning advancing through her circulatory system. Catherine made a final desperate attempt to rescue her sister. She arrived with their father, prepared to physically remove Beatrice from the boarding house regardless of legal consequences. They found Grayson in the room, sitting in a chair reading a newspaper, while his wife struggled to breathe in the bed behind him. When confronted with their intention to take Beatrice home for proper nursing care, he responded with cold, legal precision. His wife would remain where she belonged. Any attempt to remove her would result in criminal charges for kidnapping and theft of property. The argument that followed brought the landlady and several boarders to the door, curious about the commotion. Catherine, past caring about propriety, described her sister's condition in explicit detail that made several listeners blanch. She accused Grayson directly of murdering his wife through deliberate cruelty disguised as marital rights. Her father, more measured but equally determined, offered to assume all costs of Beatrice's care if Grayson would simply allow her to leave for a few weeks to recover. Grayson refused with the confidence of a man who knew the law stood firmly on his side. He had done nothing illegal. He had exercised rights granted by marriage contract and supported by Scripture. If his wife's health had suffered, that was unfortunate, but not his responsibility. Women were fragile creatures prone to mysterious ailments. Many wives experienced difficult adjustments to married life. Those who survived did so by accepting their duties without complaint. Those who did not survive had constitutions too weak for the rigors of adult life. This final statement, delivered with casual indifference to the dying woman behind him, broke something in Catherine. She lunged at Grayson with fury that required both her father and the landlady to restrain her. The confrontation ended with threats of police involvement if the family did not leave immediately. Catherine departed in tears, her father supporting her weight as they stumbled down the stairs. They had no legal recourse. No authority would intervene. Beatrice would die in that room, and her husband would face no consequences beyond the inconvenience of arranging another marriage once a decent interval had passed. The church made its own intervention attempt, though motivated more by concern for appearances than genuine compassion. Reverend Cuthbert visited in late July, disturbed by rumors that one of his parishioners was dying under circumstances that reflected poorly on Christian marriage. He found conditions worse than gossip had suggested. Beatrice was clearly in her final days, her body ravaged by infection that no amount of prayer or medical treatment could reverse. The room smelled of death already arrived, and waiting for formalities to conclude. The Reverend spoke privately with Grayson, suggesting that perhaps allowing Beatrice's family to care for her in these final days might be Christian charity worth extending. Grayson rejected this suggestion, with the same arguments he had used against Catherine. His wife would die in her proper place, under her husband's roof and authority. He would not surrender her to family members who had encouraged her resistance to wifely duties. The Reverend left without pressing further, unwilling to challenge a husband's legal prerogatives even when exercised unto death. Beatrice's last coherent words were spoken to Dr. Ashford during his visit on August 2nd. She asked him, in a whisper barely audible, whether death hurt. He assured her it would not, that she would simply slip away when her body finally surrendered its struggle. She seemed satisfied with this answer, closing her eyes with something approaching peace. She had endured 10 months of torture that society deemed legal and religion called righteous. Death was not punishment but release. The only escape Victorian law would permit her from a marriage that had destroyed her one cell at a time. Beatrice died on August 7th, 1892, 11 months after her wedding. Dr. Ashford was present when she stopped breathing, having been summoned by the landlady who noticed the death rattle had begun. Grayson was at his shop, conducting business as usual. Having informed the landlady that morning, he expected his wife to expire within days, and saw no reason to disrupt his commercial activities to sit vigil. When notified of her death, he returned home only to handle necessary arrangements, showing neither grief nor relief. Simply the practical concern of a man dealing with an inconvenient situation now concluded. The death certificate, filled out by Ashford with a hand that trembled slightly as he wrote, listed the cause as septicemia resulting from extensive dermatological lesions of unknown origin. This phrasing was technically accurate while omitting the circumstances that created those lesions. Ashford could have written that the patient died from repeated physical trauma inflicted by her husband, despite medical warnings that such contact would prove fatal. But such honesty would accomplish nothing except destroying his medical career. The death certificate became another document that told partial truth, preserving Victorian propriety while burying uncomfortable reality beneath sanitized language. Beatrice's family was not notified until after her body had been removed to the undertaker. Catherine learned of her sister's death from a neighbor who had seen the funeral wagon outside the boarding house. She arrived at her parents' home with this news to find her mother already in mourning clothes, having somehow sensed the loss before official notification arrived. The family's grief was compounded by rage at being denied even the dignity of attending Beatrice in her final hours. Grayson had exercised his legal right to exclude them, and that exclusion extended beyond death into funeral arrangements. The service was held 3 days later at Fourth Presbyterian Church, the same venue that had hosted the wedding 11 months earlier. Grayson had selected a closed casket, despite his mother-in-law's request to view her daughter one final time. The undertaker, who had prepared the body, understood this decision. Beatrice's corpse bore evidence of suffering that would shock mourners unaccustomed to seeing the physical results of prolonged systemic infection and tissue destruction. Better to remember her as she had been before marriage than confront what marriage had made of her. Reverend Cuthbert delivered a eulogy that praised Beatrice's devotion to duty and submission to divine will. He spoke of her patient suffering as evidence of Christian virtue, a young woman who had borne her cross without complaint and now received her eternal reward. The sermon made no mention of how that cross had been imposed, or by whom. Suffering was presented as random divine testing rather than the direct result of human cruelty protected by law. Several congregants wept at the Reverend's words, moved by this narrative of faithful endurance, while remaining carefully blind to the reality that Beatrice had been tortured to death with their tacit approval. The burial took place in a small cemetery on the city's outskirts. Grayson had purchased a modest plot, spending no more than necessary on a woman who had failed to provide him with children or adequate domestic service before her inconvenient death. Catherine stood at the graveside with her parents, watching dirt fall on her sister's coffin, while Grayson remained dry-eyed and impatient to conclude the ceremony. He had already made inquiries about suitable second wives, having informed his business associates that he intended to remarry as soon as propriety allowed. The most obscene detail emerged during the funeral reception held at the church hall. Grayson's mother, offering condolences to Beatrice's parents, mentioned how unfortunate it was that her son's first marriage had proven so difficult. She hoped his next wife would have a stronger constitution and more willing disposition. The implication was clear. Beatrice had failed as a wife by dying, had proven herself inadequate to the demands of marriage through her inability to survive it. Her death was personal failure rather than murder by legal means. Medical journals published brief obituary notices in September, noting the unfortunate outcome of the mysterious dermatological case that had generated such interest earlier in the year. These notices expressed regret that the condition's cause remained unknown and suggested further research might prevent similar tragedies in future. None mentioned that prevention would require challenging laws and customs that granted husbands lethal authority over wives. None acknowledged that Beatrice had died not from medical mystery, but from social order functioning exactly as designed. Grayson remarried in February of 1893, just 6 months after Beatrice's burial. His second wife was 19, selected for youth and reportedly docile temperament. She showed no signs of mysterious skin conditions, bore Grayson 3 children over the following decade, and lived to see her grandchildren grown. Whether she was genuinely more compatible with her husband or simply more skilled at enduring what he imposed cannot be determined from surviving records. But her survival suggested that Beatrice's condition was indeed specific to her particular biology or psychology, not a universal reaction to Grayson's person that would affect all women. The case of Beatrice Grayson vanished from medical literature within a decade of her death. The brief flurry of interest that made her suffering into intellectual puzzle faded as new medical mysteries captured professional attention. Dr. Ashford's meticulous records were filed in the Pennsylvania Medical Society archives, where they gathered dust for generations alongside thousands of other Victorian case studies. Nobody thought to preserve Beatrice's letters to her sister. The photographs taken during medical examinations, if they ever existed, have been lost. What remains is clinical documentation devoid of the human voice that might have explained what it felt like to die by degrees, while everyone with power to intervene chose not to act. Modern medical understanding offers explanations. Victorian doctors could not access. Beatrice likely suffered from a severe form of dermatographism, combined with chronic stress-induced immune dysfunction. Her body was attacking itself in response to repeated trauma, both physical and psychological. The condition was real, not imagined, but its severity was amplified by the impossible situation in which she was trapped. Knowing that each night would bring renewed pain created a state of perpetual stress that compromised her immune system. The lack of any escape or control over when trauma would occur essentially trained her body to respond with maximum inflammatory response to any contact. Some modern researchers who have studied the case suggest it may have been an extreme manifestation of what we now call psychophysiological disorder, where psychological trauma manifests through genuine physical symptoms. The mind-body connection operates in both directions. Severe psychological distress can trigger autoimmune responses, inflammatory conditions, and systemic breakdown. Beatrice's mind understood she was being harmed, even if Victorian society refused to name that harm. Her body responded by trying to protect her through the only means available, creating a physical barrier of damaged tissue that signaled danger even when social conditioning demanded she submit without resistance. But focusing on the medical explanation risks missing the larger horror. Whether Beatrice's condition was primarily physical or primarily psychological ultimately matters less than the legal and social structures that prevented intervention. Victorian law treated women as property, without autonomous rights to bodily integrity. Religion reinforced this hierarchy by teaching that female suffering was divinely ordained. Medicine documented harm, but lacked authority to override male privilege. Every institution conspired to ensure that husbands could legally destroy wives through abuse disguised as marital rights. The case represents thousands of similar stories that went unrecorded. How many Victorian women died from injuries inflicted by husbands who faced no consequences because the violence was legal? How many women developed mysterious ailments that doctors dismissed as hysteria, while the true cause was trauma that could not be named or prevented? Medical archives contain countless references to female patients suffering unexplained conditions that appeared during marriage and sometimes vanished after widowhood. Modern readers can see the pattern Victorian doctors either missed or chose to ignore. What makes Beatrice's case particularly disturbing is how well documented it was. Multiple physicians examined her. Medical societies discussed her condition. Journalists wrote about the mysterious ailment. Yet despite all this attention and documentation, nobody intervened to stop the contact killing her. Everyone understood that continued physical intimacy with her husband would prove fatal. Medical professionals stated this clearly in written reports. Yet the husband's legal right to access his wife's body superseded her right to survive. Society deemed this not just acceptable, but proper, the natural order of marriage that required preservation even at the cost of a woman's life. The 19th century ended. Laws slowly changed. Women gained property rights, then voting rights, eventually legal recognition as persons rather than possessions. Modern marriage law no longer grants husbands absolute authority over wives' bodies. Marital rape is now a recognized crime in most jurisdictions. Medical ethics prioritize patient autonomy over family hierarchy. But these changes came too late for Beatrice and women like her, who died because the law protected their murderers, and society called that murder righteousness. Beatrice Grayson was 21 years old when she died, her body destroyed by 11 months of legally sanctioned torture. She left no children, no published words, No memorial beyond clinical case notes that treated her suffering as intellectual curiosity. Her grave marker, if it still exists, likely bears only her married name and dates of birth and death, giving no hint of the horror those dates bracket. She deserves to be remembered not as a medical mystery, but as a victim of systematic violence that society refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require admitting that laws and customs that defined Victorian civilization were instruments of torture. If this story disturbs you, if it makes you realize how recently women had no legal protection from marital violence, then subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. We dig into the cases history tried to bury, the stories that make us uncomfortable, because they reveal how darkness was woven into laws and customs we thought were civilized. Drop a comment about other historical injustices you want exposed. We are building a community that refuses to look away from the truth, no matter how ugly. Because remembering these victims, speaking their names, telling their stories, that is the only justice we can offer them now.